Some time during our song service for our devotional, taking one of the Psalms, and this month we are going to be looking at Psalm 87. Psalm 87. As the notation states, this was a psalm or a song that was probably used as a devotion or in their worship assembly. And when we look at this psalm and the nature of this psalm, I think it will make sense as to why. It differs from many of the psalms, and a lot of the psalms have a lot of similar characteristics. And this one has some similar information, some similar thoughts, but it is different. This particular psalm is primarily dealing with the house of God, the place of worship. Jerusalem is mentioned in particular, but I think it's simply a reference to where God is and to where God makes his abode, to where people can meet with God, and the joys and the pleasures of assembling where God is. And so we'll look at it from that standpoint. Obviously, when God set up worship under the law of Moses, the place to worship was at Jerusalem. And so these individuals were in the physical place of Jerusalem, a physical nation, a physical, where they lived physically, but it was also the place where God would meet them spiritually. It starts by saying his foundation is in the holy mountains. The holy mountain, Jerusalem sat upon a hill, a mountain. You'll remember many times throughout the Bible, in reference to Jerusalem, it talks about it being upon a hill or upon a mountain. Isaiah, when prophesying of the church, mentioned that people would go up to the Lord's house or go up to the mountain of the Lord to receive his word. And we know that Jerusalem was the place where the first gospel sermon was preached, where the church was started, where it began. It began upon a mountain. Well, here God's foundation is in this mountain. There was something special about Jerusalem. And physically speaking, today there's not anything necessarily special about Jerusalem except for the fact that there is history there. Historically speaking, that's where God met with his people during the Old Testament, and that's where the church started. So historically speaking, there is some significance, but only in the sense of history for us today. Verse 2, the Lord loveth the gates of Zion more than all the dwellings of Jacob. Zion here, a reference to Jerusalem. And when it says that God loved Jerusalem more than any other place that Israelites lived, it didn't mean that he didn't love where all the other Israelites lived. He loved those places just as much as he loved Jerusalem. But he specified, or he set apart or sanctified Jerusalem for a purpose that was different than all the others. And that kind of did set it apart in a very majestic way. There's only one place that God had the temple, the place of worship, to meet with him, and that was at Jerusalem. And the same goes for the church today. There's only one place where God meets with his people today for worship, and that's in his holy mountain, the church, spiritually speaking. And it's not that God doesn't love the rest of the places on earth. He created the earth. He loved it all. There's nothing about the world he doesn't love. He made it. So when it says he loveth one place more than another, it just means he put special significance there. There is special significance in Jerusalem in the day of David, and there's a special significance there only for us, as I mentioned, historically speaking. But when we look at as it pertains to a place of worship, well, that place of worship being the church today, there's special significance there. I think we could look at it and say God loves the church, the place of worship, more than he loves any other place, because he set that place apart for a specific purpose. Verse 3, glorious things are spoken of thee, O city of God. There are glorious things mentioned about Jerusalem, just as there are many glorious things mentioned about the church. We sang songs this afternoon about the church, about the one foundation of the church. And there are many things that are spoken of greatly of Jerusalem and of the church. If we were to look at God's place of worship and make application to today, the many things that were spoken of Jerusalem, obviously the triumphs of Jerusalem, the history of Jerusalem, the Israelite nations, the influence of Jerusalem on the rest of the world, the promises that God gave. There are many things that are wonderfully spoken of Jerusalem. And these glorious things are spoken because it is where God, it is the city of God, in the sense that God said, this is where I want you to worship. And that was obviously to the day of David in the Old Testament. And where God meets with us today is in His church on the first day of each week. The city of God is His church, the house of God. Verse 4, I will make mention of Rahab and Babylon to them that know me. Behold, Philistia and Tyre with Ethiopia. This man was born there, and of Zion it shall be said, this and that man was born in her, and the highest himself shall establish her. Here, the psalmist is making mention of very well-known places on earth. Rahab here is a reference to Egypt. The only reason I can think of as to why Rahab is mentioned here as a reference to Egypt is in a generic sense, the word that's translated Rahab means very influential, terrible, and influential in a very terrible way, strong, powerful, prideful. Egypt had a reputation of being strong and powerful and terrible, but in a prideful way. But if you said in that day you were from Egypt, everyone knew where you were from. You could go anywhere in the world and they would know, because Egypt was very powerful. The same thing mentioned of Babylon, Philistia, Tyre, Ethiopia. If you said you were born in one of these areas, people knew where you were from because it was a very popular place. And so what the psalmist here is saying is Zion's on the top of the list with those. That you can go anywhere in the world and say, I'm from Jerusalem, I was born there, and there comes some sort of honor from that because of what God had set aside Jerusalem for. Verse 6, the Lord shall count when He writeth up the people that this man was born there. God, in a physical sense, would look upon Jerusalem as a very special place, in other words. If a person was born in Jerusalem, as opposed to born in Corinth, or as opposed to being born somewhere else, that God didn't treat them differently, did He? If a Jew or an Israelite was born somewhere other than Jerusalem in the known world, God didn't treat them differently. But the idea here is that God counted Jerusalem to be special. And I think the way the psalmist is writing this is by saying when someone says Jerusalem or Zion, that's a high place in the mind of God. And when you look at it from a spiritual standpoint, that Jerusalem is the place where God would meet with His people and allow them to commune with Him and to worship with Him. The Lord shall count when He writeth up this people that this man was born there. You know, I think of the New Testament church, right? The place of worship today. Does the Lord not count when He writeth up the people that these people are born there? It does make a difference, doesn't it, today, where you're born, spiritually speaking. John chapter 3, except a man be born again of water and the Spirit, he shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. And of course, Jesus explains that being born again is not a physical birth, but a spiritual birth of water. That is the means of baptism, and then the Spirit being the truth, the means that teaches us how to obey that plan or obey that command to be born again. And then, of course, Acts chapter 2, verse 47, the Bible tells us that those individuals who were baptized in Acts chapter 2, verse 38, were added to the Lord's church. They were born there. That's where they reside. And so I think when we look at this psalm, from my standpoint anyway, I think when we look at Jerusalem and Zion as being the place of worship where God meets with His people, it's a special place. And I don't know if there's any prophetic in this, but I think it's very applicable to the church today. That especially with that idea of birth, because the physical birth, obviously, if you were born an Israelite, it doesn't matter where in the world you were born, you were still an Israelite. But today, the only way to be born into the kingdom is to be obedient to the gospel of Christ and to obey that gospel. And once you obey that gospel, the Lord adds you to the church, the kingdom. And so you've been born again. You've obeyed the gospel, you've been born again. And the Lord will look at that and say, these people were born there. These are my people because they've been born into the kingdom. And then the word Selah there, we don't really know exactly what those mean, but most likely they were musical notations, like we have musical notations in our hymn book. Forte, mezzo forte. It might have something to do with the speed. It may have to do with a rest. It may have to do with repeat. It's something to do with the song itself. It doesn't have any meaning as far as further than just the notation of the musical part of it. And then in verse 7, the psalmist says, as well the singers as the players on instruments shall be there. All my springs are in thee. Well, to start at the last, a spring, a place, a fountain of water. I love fresh, clean, flowing water. And those are, if I can find those places, those are my favorite places. If I could just sit there and listen to the water run, and there's nothing better than grabbing a nice handful of fresh, clean water right out of the mountain, and drinking it. It's fresh. It's refreshing. So the place where God is, the place where people worship God, it's a refreshing place. It's a renewing place. It's a very refreshing, comfortable environment. Okay, so the environment is fresh, it's clean, it's pure. All those things that you could apply to a spring, a nice freshwater spring. Now, as far as the singers and the players on instruments shall be there, we go back to the idea of referencing the city, the place itself, and how honorable it is. One of the things that took place and still takes place today on special occasions are things like parades, right? I think that's kind of what's being mentioned here. There's a parade. We're going to celebrate. Why? Because of how honorable it is, how honorable this thing is, or this place is in this particular case. There'll be singers. There'll be instruments played. There'll be a parade. There'll be a celebration, a place of honor. It's a place of celebration and honor. So Jerusalem was set aside. It was a place that people would look to and enjoy and appreciate and honor and celebrate. It was a place of refreshment and an environment, a clean, pure environment. And so I think that's what those were. There literal singers, and there may have been. There may have been a little. But we know that when David won battles, when kings won battles, there would be some kind of, there would be a sort of a parade as come in, a triumphant parade. They would play music. They would sing. Why? Because they were joyous. And they would do this to give thanks to God for the victory. But it was an honor for the victor, right? For the king, for the city, for Jerusalem. So whether this is a reference to something like that, I think these literal events did take place. I don't know if the psalmist in this particular text is talking about a literal event as much as he's referencing that event to show victory honor, celebration, right? In Isaiah chapter 35, the prophet Isaiah, this is a reference to a remnant coming out of Babylonian captivity. But I think you can see and make application to the church today too, just like we kind of did here with this psalm. But in Isaiah 35, verse 8, Isaiah says, "A highway shall be there and a way, and it shall be called the way of holiness. The unclean shall not pass over it, but it shall be for those, the wayfaring men, though fools, shall not err therein." Well, there's obviously a way of holiness today, is there not? Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me." He's the highway. He's the way of holiness. Well, there was a way out of Babylonian captivity as well, and that was being right with God, being faithful to God. "No lion," verse 9, "shall be there, nor any ravenous beast shall go up thereon. It shall not be found there, but the redeemed shall walk there." So it's not, this way is a way that is protected, defended, it's safe. And he mentions the redeemed there. That would be those who were safely brought out of captivity. Christians today obviously have been brought out of captivity to sin. Verse 10, "The ransomed of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with songs and everlasting joy upon their heads. They shall obtain joy and gladness, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away." So as they left Babylon and came back into Jerusalem, there would be almost a parade atmosphere, wasn't there? But there's also that joyous atmosphere when one is added to the church, knowing that he's had his sins washed away and that he has hope of eternal life. And very quickly, in Hebrews chapter 2, Hebrews chapter 2, verse 9, the Hebrews writer says, "We see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels for the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, that he by the grace of God should taste death for every man. For it became him for whom are all things, and by whom are all things, in bringing many sons unto glory, to make the captain of their salvation perfect through sufferings. For both he that sanctifieth and they who are sanctified are all of one, for which cause he is not ashamed to call them brethren, saying, I will declare thy name unto my brethren. In the midst of the church will I sing praise unto thee." So there's a reason to be joyous and to sing songs, right, in the church, because of the grace and the glory and the perfect sacrifice that made salvation possible in the church. So I think Psalm 87 primarily is dealing with meeting God in his place of worship. And yes, Jerusalem, the physical city, great things can be said of it. And I think the psalmist is referencing that physical city of Jerusalem. But I think that the application can be made not just to the place that it was the center of worship in that world, but to the church today being the place, a center of worship. And all these glorious things can be said about it and the honor and glory of being in it. So that's, I think, important as we make application to us today. So, the house of God, the place where God meets with us to worship. The Bible teaches us that Jesus built a church. He built one church. He is the head of that church. He is the author of salvation to that church. He is the king over that kingdom, the church and the kingdom being the same. And he has all authority. He is the one lawgiver of that church. And in order to get into that church, one must hear his word, believe it, repent of their sins, confess that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and be immersed in water to have their sins washed away. The Lord then adds those obedient souls to his church. They're born again into the kingdom, Acts chapter 2, verse 47, and John chapter 3, verse 3 through 5. And upon that obedience and being added to the Lord's church, if they'll remain faithful to the end, they can receive a crown of life, Revelation 2, verse 10. And so it is our goal to remain